Is that going to be you today?
Yes, sir. Just give me just one moment and make sure we get on YouTube and then
Sure.
right away. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Mr. Farmer
Yes, sir.
and Ms. Holthouse. I
Yes,
count only 8 members right now. So I don't know if we have a quorum yet.
All right. Well,
Maybe we do now. Someone just joined us.
Yes, I think we're there.
all
Another
right.
one.
Okay. Councilmember Brost.
Here.
Thank you. Member Bonnersmeyer.
Here.
Councilmember Edens. Member Sturman.
Here.
Councilmember Ottenberg.
Here.
Member Berger.
Here.
Councilmember Bertolino. Member Patton. Councilmember Rambo. Member Bramman.
Here.
Councilmember Hopper.
Here.
Member Donaldson. Councilmember Galani. Co-chair Farmer
Here.
and co-chair Holthouse.
here.
Thank you.
All right. Carol, did you have anything you wanted to kick us off with today?
Just wanted to Councilmember Rambo, I don't think is on, is he? He'd be better able to speak to this, but I did want to let this group know that Teresa Clark has made a donation to fund a tree and a plaque in honor of Dr. Hammer's son. And anybody who wants to help defray the cost of that can contact her with what they'd like to. It had to be sort of a private thing to keep it from being any sort of a thing the city was soliciting. But if you would like to help Teresa, and if we end up with enough money to plant more than one tree, we'll just keep going. So.
All right, great. Yeah, I think Rob is laid up here with having, I think he maybe had some surgery or something. He was incapacitated a bit the other night, laying on his back. So I don't have anything really too much to add either. I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit, but for those of you that aren't on the council and didn't happen to see the meeting the other night, we're kind of continuing down this path a little bit to get the USGS guys going and some of the permitting things. So we'll talk a little bit about that later, but we're still on the trail, I suppose, but we'll get there. All right. I guess we probably need the approval of the minutes. Does anybody want to make a motion to approve the minutes from last week or last month? Mr. Ottenberg, is there a second?
I second.
Mr. Rahman. All those in favor of approving the minutes, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? And any abstentions?
I'll abstain, Joe.
All right. One abstention, Mr. Brost, and the minutes are approved. Great. Do we have any public comments or anything? Anybody that is watching? I don't think we have any attendees, so I assume not. All right. That's good.
Councilmember Farmer.
Yes, sir.
Councilmember Edens asked me to pass along her regrets. She cannot participate.
Yeah, it happens from time to time. It's all good. We got enough folks so we can continue on, and she can catch up as we go later. That'll be all good. All right. So I guess that takes us to the scope of services and work products. Mr. Vunich, is that you or Mr. Wilson? Who's going to handle that this evening?
Mr. Farmer, I was kind of going to set the table, so to speak, and then turn the meeting over with Ms. Holthouse and yours permission to Mr. Wilson and Mr. Wagner.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Members of the task force, at our last meeting in July, Mr. Wilson and Mr. Wagner presented the final draft of what they described as their analysis of the 6 critical locations that have been identified in the Cox Creek watershed. Along with that analysis, they provide design schematics for each of them, along with engineered cost estimates. That represented what the department is now describing as phase one of their activity. Phase two is a report that is on tonight's agenda relative to 4 major topics. Mr. Wagner at our last meeting did a wonderful job of kind of going over the basics. I would call it basic 101 detention and retention basin information. Tonight, you actually have the report that's been prepared by Mr. Wilson and Mr. Wagner. That report goes into much greater detail and analysis relative to the 50 or so basins that are located within the Cox Creek watershed. Their relative location when compared to our top locations or critical locations, that being the Triple Meander in Cox Creek and the nearby detention basin, and then goes into further details relative to the capacity and potential benefits from alterations to those existing systems. Thereafter, Mr. Wilson and Mr. Wagner then provide a brief description of other areas of concern they discovered during their field investigations in Cox Creek, then moves on to what I would describe as some recommendations relative to bridge building and culvert placement in any of the mainline channels or watersheds of Wildwood. And then finally, just some tips on preventative maintenance and management of watersheds and mainline channels. And with that, I will defer to the 2 experts, our consultants, and let them kind of go over the report briefly. Both Mr. Wilson and Mr. Wagner are ready to take any questions or comments. And again, this is what I would consider the draft, and certainly we'll have a final report just as we did for phase 1. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vunich. I want to give you more of just kind of an overview of what's in the report. I realize you haven't had it in your hands very long to maybe get into a lot of the details, but we can talk about it at whatever level of detail that you're interested in talking. I'm going to see if I can get get some slides up here where you can see these. Well, that's not going to work. Let's try something else here. Okay, can you see the title slide for
Yes,
tonight's
sir.
discussion?
Yep.
Okay. Again, I want to start off by thanking Mr. Vunich and the rest of the City of Wildwood staff. And I realize that I have been quite remiss in not mentioning the assistance and cooperation of Mr. Cross, the council members, and the members of the task force. We greatly appreciate your attention and thoughtful consideration to these projects as we've gone along. Your questions and comments have been greatly appreciated, and they contribute to a much better end product. So I did want to say thank you to members of the task force. Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about, as Mr. Vunich mentioned, the detention analysis, some additional areas of concern, go into some of the general design guidelines that are associated with siding, bridges, and culverts, and talk about some O&M concerns and some basic recommendations and conclusions. And as always, if you have questions, please jump right in, and we'll do our best to try and get those addressed. And if we can't address them tonight, we'll figure out. We'll put our heads together after the meeting, and we'll figure it out for you. So I guess we'll start off with the detention. Todd gave you an overview of kind of where we were going with the detention last time. I think the biggest thing that we've accomplished since the last meeting is that we've fine-tuned the storage volumes in the detention basins that are available and prioritize the detention basins for further study based on the storage volume that's available. And we've taken a little bit of time to identify some of the advantages and challenges that are associated with a detention retrofit project. We've got 92 surface storage detention structures in Cox Creek watershed. There are a couple of underground facilities, but we did not include those in this portion of the study as the underground facilities, they're pretty limited on what types of modifications you can do to those structures. And Todd, jump in here anytime if I leave something out here. So about half of these detention basins are located upstream of the Triple Meander. You can see that on this slide, the yellow areas are the detention basin locations. And we took the database from MSD and we cross-referenced that with the TerraSpec study so that in the detailed table, if you're looking for specific information about a structure, there's both the alternate ID and the MSD ID number for each of these particular structures. So got a way of cross-referencing and moving between the studies. Okay.
Jump in here.
I'm sorry.
Is
Go
there
ahead.
is there a way to take those and sort of get some sense of where they're actually located? I didn't see any latitude or longitudinal references. You know, you've got sort of an MSD code. Is there any easy way to crack that? I guess it would be my question.
I can modify the table and put a Latin long in there, if that would be helpful.
I think for mere mortals, that would be a real plus, at least speaking for myself. So,
Oh, absolutely.
given that will take some time, if anybody else thinks that's a waste of their time, let me know. But
No, it's not a very time consuming task, so it wouldn't take long to throw those into the table. So
okay, thank you very much.
I agree with Carol.
let me make a note here
I agree with her as well.
so that after I go to sleep tonight, I won't have forgotten everything we talked about here. Okay. These are the, are any other questions on that before I move on? Okay. These are the top 10 basins. The red outline is the drainage area upstream of the Triple Meander. And you can see there are 6 detention basins of the top 6 of the top 10 volume wise are located upstream of the Triple Meander. Now, we did not include Lake Chesterfield in this particular analysis. There's a lot of things that are going on with Lake Chesterfield as far as its ability to hold water. The modification of a structure that size would take a fairly detailed study. So we felt like there might need to be some additional information collected before we could really talk about the potential for using Lake Chesterfield in an intelligent way. So the 6 basins upstream of the meander, and then we've got 4 that are downstream. 1 is in close proximity to the to Cox Creek. The others are a little more remote. And as Mr. Wagner talked about last time, the basins in close proximity to the main stream are probably going to provide a little more peak flow control on the mainstream, as in reducing the runoff rates. The ones that are more remote from the mainstream contribute greatly to the overall water quality in that they reduce flows, erosive flows that are coming through the tributaries, which are a major source of the gravel and cobbles that are showing up in the main channel. So anything we can do to reduce flows even in the upper ends of the tributaries is going to prove to be beneficial. Okay, we've got several areas identified as potential regional detention areas. There are a number of things that regional detention can do for you, and that's provide a more effective flood control. This particular site, we're looking at the Wildwood Meadows area. There's the large existing detention pond at the south end of that development, and then there's a large open field that's immediately upstream of one of the proposed bank stabilization projects. So there's some opportunity there to reconnect the floodplain to the stream and possibly provide some off-channel storage that you could see some benefits in the mainstream due to reduced flow rates and improved water quality with regional detention. Now, as Todd had mentioned, there's some issues that go with regional detention. The main thing is dealing with ownership and future maintenance. So those are some of the things that will come into play. And I believe that that's one of the things that the USGS is looking at as part of their study is some additional storage adjacent to the stream in some of these floodplain areas. So their study will address some of this in a lot more detail. And again, I'm not going through every component of the report. We'd be here way past the 8 o'clock deadline if we did that. So I'm going to try and keep my comments as brief as possible. And then after you all have had a chance to look into it in more detail and generate some questions, we could get more specific at a later date, if that's acceptable to everyone.
A quick question on this one.
Yes,
I
ma'am.
believe it was one that you mentioned, a lot of the benefits would actually be downstream and outside of Wildwood. Is that Chesterfield that would be partnering with if it was appropriate to engage a downstream partner?
Absolutely. Any body that's part of the watershed, to engage them is in part of the process and try and bring them along with your program is going to be to everybody's advantage. So that's a good point. That's a good point. And just to rehash a little of what we talked about last time, these retrofits for detention are going to be pretty cost-effective long-term mitigation of some of the impacts of urbanization, such as an increase in peak flow rate, faster response time of the stream. If you can incorporate some bioretention, there can be some overall runoff volume reduction. So these detention basin retrofits can be pretty cost effective. Another good thing is they can be implemented in phases. You don't have to try and retrofit all 92 basins in the city at one time. One of the, I guess, pluses, it's both an advantage and disadvantage. It's a disadvantage from the cost, but it's a major advantage from understanding how your system works, is you really have to do engineering analysis of the entire system to verify that the modification of those detention basins are not causing adverse impacts, unintended consequences elsewhere. So there's a little bit of a plus and a major plus. There can also be a major cost with some of that as well. Another pitfall problem area is it's going to require cooperation and coordination with the homeowners associations, because the majority of these things are owned privately. The retrofitting of the detention basins will not fix the existing problems in the stream. It's not going to make make all of the excess gravel bed load go away, but it will slow the development of future problems. There is definitely a potential for some additional regional detention and floodplain restoration in Calks Creek watershed. There are several locations that Todd has identified in our report that at least provide some opportunity for some increased storage and improvement for overall water quality.
Mr. Wilson, would now be an appropriate time for me to ask a question.
Oh, absolutely.
On your bullet point where it says will not fix existing problems, but will slow the development of future downstream erosion. I know this may be a challenging question to answer, but if it slows the development, how long might it be until we would have to revisit some of these issues?
I really can't answer that, sir.
Okay.
There's just so many variabilities depending on the location. There's a lot of things that have to interact in order to arrest the erosion completely, and it's pretty much an ongoing process. I'm not sure that you're going to have much of a window in there where you don't have something that requires attention.
No, I realize there's a lot of moving parts here, for lack of a better term, that come into play. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Todd, do you have anything to add to that, sir?
Yeah, I'll jump in and maybe to kind of address both that question and Ms. Holthouse question. That yes, this is the one that you were looking at there is I believe the second from the bottom or lowest in the watershed. There's another even larger area that we identified that is further downstream that really is just at the northern edge of your city limits. And so there would be benefits downstream to a short section within Wildwood, but not a lot. So that would be the downside of that. Excuse me. Phone started ringing. That would be the downside of that. Now, this particular one is Wild Horse Estate, Wildwood Estates. Correct me if I'm wrong there.
Wildwood Meadows.
Wildwood Meadows, I'm sorry. Wildwood and Meadows, that one, like Joe mentioned, that is just directly upstream of the Wildwood Meadows project that we included the cost of in our phase 1 report. And so in this case, this could be something that you could look at, maybe even look at the two in combination and maybe have some combination of stream stabilization and flow reduction so that to answer your questions that, yeah, maybe that could be done in such a way that it would buy you some time or save you some money on that downstream project. Exactly how much, it's hard to predict because, like we said, every site's unique and there's a lot of variables there. But I think that it's important to remember that these need to be looked at. If you're looking at it on a watershed-wide basis, they need to be looked at in combination, and probably some modeling would need to be done to evaluate exactly how much of a benefit that you could get from each individual site and how much benefit it would provide immediately downstream or 1 mile downstream and so on. So it kind of becomes a pretty complex matrix of analysis when you really start looking at multiple projects and multiple detention areas. And one thing I'd like to point out that I think should be a concern, something that you'd have to think hard about, is on these regional detention areas. Some of them have a very nice forest cover currently. So if you were to do some work in those floodplain areas, some of that forest cover might have to be removed, which is a downside. Now, you can always have a reforestation program and work on bringing back forest cover again in those areas, but that is a downside of some of these sites, not this one in particular, but some of the other sites have a lot of tree cover, which is what you want in your riparian corridors. And so to incorporate more storage, yeah, that's a good thing, but to lose some of your canopy would not be such a good thing, and it would take several years to begin to build that back up again. So just something to keep in mind.
Thanks, Todd. Any other thoughts or questions on that?
Hey,
Okay.
Joe, this is Rick Brown.
Yes, sir.
Since we're asking questions, I'm very interested in both and I know Joe is too, the detention basin modification possibilities and even the regional basin possibilities. And I know you haven't done a detailed analysis yet, so it might be hard to answer the question, but you have any idea as far as how much decreased flood risk would result from this effort if we were to move forward at this point in time? Do you have any idea? What I'm getting at is it seems there is funding available for projects that impact, flood risk. So if these basin modifications or regional basins can impact that positively, I got to believe we could get some money.
I would think that anything that you're wanting to do here is going to have to be looked at in terms of the overall flood risk, and the intent would be to you're not going to want to do anything that would increase flood risk for anybody. So everything's got to work within the constraints of existing flood risk or better. So particularly with the regional detentions, I think you could probably have some significant impacts on flood risk for downstream properties with additional overbank storage. So does that answer your question, Rick? Sort of.
Sure. I mean, I don't expect to have a detailed answer to that for sure. But
No, I mean, as far as numbers, no, I can't really give you any percentage or anything at this stage of the game.
I would add to that on the retrofits of the existing flood control basins, okay, they're already giving you flood control for your 10 and your 25 and your 100-year, your big floods. But what we're talking about is retrofitting them to focus on that 1 to 2 year and reduce it more so that we can protect your banks from eroding. So they're not, what we've been talking about here isn't to reduce flood flows at that 10 or 25 or 100-year level, but it's to reduce it down at that low end so that we can protect your stream banks better. Now, like Joe said on the regionals, yes, that's storage that you're currently getting very little storage out of now. And if you excavate some of those floodplain areas, you'll get a lot of storage there. You could reduce the 1 year, 2 year flow. You could reduce the 25-year, the 100-year. You could reduce all of those flows, and you could get more flood control out of that. But I would say at this point, it's really difficult to try to estimate exactly how much, because it varies. Immediately downstream might be a big impact, but then further downstream, it might not be such a big impact. There's just so many variables there until you get into the modeling. It's a little bit difficult to answer that with a short answer.
So more potential in the regional basins than potentially the existing basins that are out there for flood reduction.
I think if you're talking about the big floods, the 50-year flood or whatever, yeah, those big regional areas that we're talking about, that's where you have more potential to make some gains than any kind of a retrofit on an existing basin.
Thank you.
Joe, would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I think you're going to see benefits across the spectrum on regional basins. On the retrofitting the local site-specific basins, those are going to be more on the low end, is where you're going to see benefits. So yeah, I agree, Todd.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I think we managed to talk about that for several minutes and not really come up with an answer, but we'll push on here. Okay. Yeah, we talked a little bit about advantages and disadvantages. Talked about the floodplain restoration and regional detention. Let's look at some of these additional areas of concern. Some of these we noted when we were walking the streams. Some of them have been taken from aerial photography, particularly with some of the sanitary sewer crossings. They may not have a problem. They may be buried deep enough, but there are areas that should at least get an initial inspection to determine whether or not you've got infrastructure at risk. So in identifying stream segments, we've got 26 different locations where we've got sanitary sewers that are within 25 feet of the stream. And we know from the movement of the stream bank, it's triple meander and some of the other locations, to have 5 to 10 foot of movement in a couple of years is not unrealistic. So planning and evaluation, getting some baseline data for those is an important part of protecting your infrastructure. When we talk about roadways, they've got about 6 sections of roadway that are approximately within 25 feet of the stream or have some issues at or near a crossing. So we'll look at a couple of those in a little more detail. And then on Cox Creek, there are 7 areas that have sharp bends that are 90 degrees or more. One in particular near upstream of the Highlands at Wild Horse, we'll look at that in a little more detail, is a potential to initiate a meander bend cutoff at some point. So there's one of the things that we're recommending here is an inspection program to at least get out and visit some of these areas and determine whether or not you've got a problem that needs to be added to the priority list at this stage. And in the detail report, you see we've got some mapping here with the specific locations. This is the index map corresponding to pages, additional pages in the appendices for the northern end of the Cox Creek. The central reach is going to be on page B1 and then the upper ends at C1. So let's look at a couple of examples just to explain what we've identified at these locations. So sanitary sewers identified in a square or rectangle where there's a sanitary sewer crossing. So S1 identifies a sewer crossing. CC1 is Cox Creek number 1. I started at the upstream end and started working my way down. That's an actual scour hole at the outlet from Lake Chesterfield. So that's really where scour is initiating on the main channel that we need to start taking a look at. So again, these are some areas that warrant some additional evaluation. Another location, this is the Highlands of Wild Horse. Our project that we've identified covers this area right here. And when we look at starting at the upstream end, we've got a sanitary sewer crossing, or in this case, sanitary sewer paralleling the stream, very close to the bank. This particular bend is sharper than 90 degrees when you get back under the tree canopy. And as in the triple meander, at some point, this is likely to initiate a meander cutoff through here. So stabilization of this is something that should probably be added to the list. And we've got a sharper than 90 degree bend here. This aerial photo shows a number of trees that are no longer there. They've washed out into the stream, and again, it's upstream of the Highlands at Wild Horse project. We've got additional stream erosion or sanitary sewer upstream of the Strecker Road Bridge, and there's some alignment issues and scour issues here at Strecker Road. So the roadway issues are designated with a circle and a prefix of an R. So that's how the report's laid out, identifying those particular locations. Again, not going to try and go through all of them this evening, but we can certainly address additional questions at a later date. Any questions or comments at this point?
I do.
Yes, Sherman.
If I understood you correctly earlier by the triple meander area, were you talking about strictly a crossing or in parallel? The sanitary is uncomfortably close to the waterway. Was it the latter? Like behind Elegant Child and to the east of, are you aware that is a brand new trunk line that MSD built 2 to 3 years ago? That's all new. That entire line from up where Strecker crosses at the north end and all the way back to the south end of Elegant Child.
Yes, sir.
That's a whole new
Where
line.
that's new. There's a crossing in one of the tributaries at the downstream end of the triple meander on the be on the left bank descending. There's a tributary comes in upstream of that first group of houses on the left, and it's pretty obvious where they've gone
Okay.
through. And again, on the sanitary sewers, we were basing that based on proximity. They may be 10 foot below. I don't know. It's just it's something that we felt like really needed a little more detailed look.
And that's what I was leading up to being, I was really going to say also is that being that new, that recent, I would think the depth would have been done to an extent that it should not be presenting a problem. I would hope.
One would hope. That's not always the case. If they've got elevations that they have to tie in at the downstream end, that may limit how deep they can go. But it is an area that kind of reinforces the importance of, since you brought up the triple meander, of stabilizing the bank there at the triple meander so it doesn't cut back any further toward that sanitary sewer. So then you end up with damage to infrastructure and an environmental problem if you get a ruptured sewer line through stream bank erosion. But no, that's great comment. Any other questions? Okay, let's talk a little bit about some of the basic design considerations at bridges and culverts. The main thing in dealing with the main considerations, I guess, in dealing with bridge crossings is the horizontal and the vertical alignment of the stream at your bridge location. You really don't want to be locating bridges on curves if at all possible. You don't want to be locating bridges at inflection points in the flow line of the stream where you've got significant changes in grade coming in and going out. You got to look at the cross-sectional geometry of the stream. You don't want, sometimes you see bridges where the bridge is very long and the stream bed is actually wider going through the bridge opening than it is on the approach. You're just setting yourself up for a lot of deposition and scour issues when you don't look at the alignment of the stream, and that's a little bit of it's not quite as trivial as I guess I'm making it sound, because you've got a range of flow rates you got to deal with a bridge. You've got your everyday rains, stuff that's going to stay within the channel banks, and then you've got flow rates that are outside the channel banks, and sometimes those paths don't necessarily coincide as far as where the water's actually the direction of flow. So there's a careful balancing act in identifying those streamlines at various flow rates through the expected flow regime for the design of the bridge. The geometry of your floodplain is a consideration. There downstream of Wildwood Meadows, you've got a fairly wide floodplain there. It may be that you end up with a perched bridge situation where that your approaches can be overtopped. So there's a lot of things to look at when you're dealing with siting and designing bridges, the changes, the locations where you have changes in velocity are critical to understand when you're trying to deal with bridge scour. Oftentimes the contraction of flow at the upstream side is where the flow accelerates the most. You tend to see your scour at the upstream side of your bridges at your contraction section. So sometimes those warrant a little closer look. As far as maintenance on bridges and culverts, the best thing you can do is remove debris. If you've got a log washed up against the middle bent in a bridge, that log is a source for to initiate additional erosion due to changes in the velocity as the flow works around a root wad or a log. It's going to redirect the velocity sometimes toward the bottom, and you end up with additional scour in those particular locations. So there's again, these are some of the main points. There's some additional information in the report, and if you see something that you've got a question about or feel like we didn't address sufficiently, please let us know. Any questions on bridges? I know this one's fairly brief as far as the detail here.
That looks pretty good.
Okay. All right. When we talk about general operation and maintenance, right now you have an exceptional bed load of accumulated sediment in your stream. Selective removal of some of that material can improve the capacity of the stream, basically lower the water surface elevation. It also, by removing it from the stream, it's less material that can move down and clog it up at a lower point in the watershed. So that's something to consider. It would probably require some coordination with Corps of Engineers to develop a sediment removal program, but it would I think it would pay some pretty good dividends. Debris management, again, just like on bridges, you have a tree that falls in and redirects the flow to where that impinges on a bank at a location where it had not previously. It can often initiate and accelerate stream erosion. One of the things when you talk about O&M is vegetation management. There's a number of invasive species that provide very little protection from erosion. They provide a thick cover, but it's not at the ground surface. For one is the honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle. If you try and walk through it chest high, that stuff's so thick, you pretty well have to have a machete to work your way through it. But when you look down at the ground's bare. It's shaded out all of the grass cover and vegetation underneath the bush honeysuckle. Same thing with Lespedeza, Sericea lespedeza. The Conservation Department and MoDOT loved that stuff back in the 70s. They've cursed it ever since. It provides a thick mat of material 12 to 18 inches off the ground, and the ground is pretty well bare underneath. So those provide very little protection. So managing those types of invasive species and replacing those with native species can reduce the overbank erosion in your system. And as an operation maintenance, grade control on tributaries, Calk's Creek has widened and downcut, which that initiates downcutting in the tributaries. So if you can arrest that downcutting in the tributaries by providing grade control near the confluence with the main stream, you've removed some of the sediment load from the stream. So it can provide a significant benefit by reducing the amount of sediment that's transported through those tributaries. Changes in velocity and again, geometry of, I think apparently those were left over from when I copied the slide to start a new one, so I apologize for that. Any questions or comments on operations and maintenance?
Mr. Wilson,
Yes, sir.
this is Joe Vunich. So in terms of grade control, what's that structure look like?
The best way to provide grade control is through a rock check type dam that's keyed in to sufficient depth that it won't be undercut, and it's got to extend far enough into the bank so that the stream can't make an end run. But a rock check is usually the most effective on grade control.
Thank you.
I would try to stay away from concrete structures. Interfaces between concrete and soil are almost invariably disasters when it comes to erosion. It's a key location where erosion initiates. But
So in areas where we might have a lot of honeysuckle, I guess we would be better served removing that, and then even, I guess it would take some time for whatever we would put in there to replace it, but that's probably better, not any worse than what is currently there in the honeysuckle, correct?
that's correct, sir.
All right.
Yeah, and again, that's not a project that you're going to want to go out and try and remove every piece of honeysuckles this summer. It's an ongoing process. You can bite it off in however big a chunk you can swallow.
Mr. Wilson?
Yes, Mr. Sturman.
A rock check, if you can do it quickly, otherwise I don't want to take the time. I don't quite, what is that again? What's the basic nature? Just very, very basic nature of that again?
It's basically a rock, a riprap type, a barrier, not a barrier, but it's at the flow line of the stream. You dig it down.
Down in the bed?
Down as far down below the bed of the stream that you're tying into, so that your tributary, when it starts head cutting, when it gets to that rock, it can't go any further upstream. So
I guess I understand.
But
you have a detail or anything in your second report of something like that?
No, but I can put something in there.
Sometimes
Thank
you'll even see a series of check dams, like for erosion control on highway sites. They might use something other than rock because it's temporary, but it's the same concept, is a series of steps of rock so that the water, instead of the water coming down steep at a high velocity with a scouring velocity, the water's more level and flat. It spills down, it goes flat, it spills down, it goes flat. And you're controlling velocities. So that's the downward control of erosion. Then the other is like what Joe was saying, if you're head cutting, you're eroding back upstream. Once it hits that rock dam almost that's been cut into the soil, it can't erode through that. So it stops that upward head cutting motion also. So it kind of works in both directions as a stabilization of a steep eroding channel. And we saw that in numerous places in your tributaries. So yeah, we think that would be effective.
Thank you.
All
Any
right,
other questions?
let's
Okay.
keep going.
We'll keep going. We're gonna wrap up here pretty quick. So our recommendations and conclusions, starting off, we think that your retrofitting of your detention basins can have a pretty significant impact on the flow rates, particularly of what we refer to as the channel forming flows, the 1 year, 2 year flow rates, that we can reduce those, reduce the frequency at which the bank's flowing full, and the erosive flow rates in the stream. So we think that's a very feasible and effective approach, is to look at some of these detention modifications in more detail. The regional detention, again, I think the USGS is going to be looking at some floodplain storage areas as part of their report. So there's some additional opportunities with regional detention. As far as areas of additional concern, some type of initial inspection and periodic, yearly or so monitoring of some of these locations to establish baseline conditions and whether or not they're actively deteriorating or not would be a useful tool to have in your toolbox in an inspection program. And then a regular maintenance program to look into some of the selective sediment removal and removal of debris, particularly larger trees, root wads and such that will redirect flow in an undesired direction. These types of issues, or these types of programs, can help you address problems before they become critical and much larger in scope. And as far as conclusions, I think all of the 4 components that we looked at, they definitely show some the potential to provide benefits in reducing the stream degradation there on Calks Creek, and if applied to some of the other streams within the community, they would provide benefits there as well. And last, an integrated master planning approach is going to allow you to optimize the tools that we've identified, and will allow you to be very cost effective in your approach with your using your public resources. And that's all I've got. Todd, did you have any other comments or questions before we open it up to more questions from task force?
I don't have anything else, but yeah, I'll be happy to try to answer questions.
Anybody got anything? Looks like no. All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for that. That's very helpful. And I think it might be worth looking into, I guess, Rick, if we can find some funding for some of this detention stuff, perhaps that can slow some of our other issues down a little bit while we're figuring that out. Mr. Vunich, I see you got your hand up.
Yes, sir. Sorry, I couldn't find the feature on the bottom of my screen, so my apologies.
All right.
So Mr. Wilson and Mr. Wagner, when you talk about removal of the sediment load, we've talked also, this was via Dr. Hammer, about actually using that bed load to kind of armor the sides of the banks temporarily while we look at more permanent and probably more effective solutions. Regardless if it's to remove it or to use it for armoring purposes, how do you establish where the creek should go?
That, as far as realignment of the I guess the primary flow line of the stream, the Foulweg, what we refer to as the deepest part of the stream, relocating that. My approach is to review some of the historical photos and look at what the nature of the stream was 20 years ago, and see how close we can reestablish some of those radiuses and dimensions without adversely impacting the floodplain elevations. Obviously, anything we do, we don't want to be increasing floodplain elevations, but and your modeling is going to tell you whether or not that's going to work. But as a guideline, I'm going to look at the history of the stream is my basic approach.
Thank you.
Carol?
I believe Mr. Wagner had talked about experience in Springfield with engaging with homeowners associations And I think in addition to whatever, technical analysis leads to a assessment of how feasible location is, I think there's also, another whole side to this. And I'm wondering if there's any suggestions on how we would proceed in parallel with engaging homeowners associations as we continue a more in-depth technical assessment of these 10 priority detention basins.
I would suggest a lot of that is an education process. I think if a lot of people understand what the goal is for why you want to modify the basin, it's if they were to see some of the severe erosion in some of the locations, maybe people aren't aware of how severe it is, and if they were made aware, they might be more willing to be a good participant in the community and help allow the city or whoever to come in and make modifications and say, it would be okay if it wasn't, if it's not a manicured lawn detention area. Perhaps we want to excavate it down, allow some native plants to grow in, some taller plants that aren't manicured looking, but they can be maintained and kept beautiful in a, beauty's in the eyes of the beholder, but beautiful in a different way. And so then you've got the question about, well, is my maintenance going to be more or less? And that's going to be kind of a case by case basis to look at that. But generally, I would say you're not going to increase your maintenance costs because now you don't have to mow it, every week all summer long. So, but there will be other maintenance required to keep something like that looking nice. So, I think for the most part, it's getting probably the influential people in the HOA together. Usually my experience has been they're usually one or two or a handful of people that generally make the decisions and govern how the HOAs are managed, and get those folks together and try to educate them and answer their questions and hopefully calm any fears or concerns they might have regarding changes. That would be my first suggestion. Go from there and see if you can make any headway with some of these HOAs where out of these 10 that we identified as your most critical ones, your 10 largest ones that you could get the most bang for the buck, see if you can make any headway with some folks on those.
Okay, and maybe just kind of a show of hands from the committee members. I think we've got a lot of people that are kind of champing at the bit to do something. So, if you sort of think we've done a foundational job of there's a problem we have to address, just give me a thumbs up or something. If you think we're still back at sort of the education, I kind of feel like maybe we're at the point where people are willing to start talking about specific solutions rather than admitting there's a problem. So how many people think we've got people that know there's a problem? Give me a thumbs up. Okay.
I would expect, Carol, that in the communities that are involved and aware that that's likely the case, we may find that there are some subdivisions or neighborhoods that may need to be educated, but I wouldn't keep that from us trying to move forward and identify those. Yeah.
And that's kind of where I'm at. I guess I'd like to think we can start figuring out what the process is for contacting the trustees of the HOAs and beginning to get some sort of feedback from them on how interested they are in having a meeting or, seeing a presentation or discussing options or whatever. So.
Yeah, the initial contact is always the trickiest part. If you can get to the right person, make an initial contact and say, we're ready to do something if you're willing to let us. And if not, then we'll move on. We'll do something somewhere else.
Some subtle things too are if they know there's a citywide program or you're talking to numerous HOAs, they don't feel like they're being singled out. Like, well, why are you picking on our location or our little subdivision. No, this is a citywide program, and you're part of something that we're working on a watershed-wide basis to try to fix our worst problem, which is Cox Creek. And sometimes when people see that they're part of a bigger plan and they know that there's equity and fairness involved there, it really goes a long ways too.
Thank you for those suggestions.
Yeah, I might add, just having been on our HOA here for a while, like I think if we go to some of these HOAs with like an actual, direct solution with a handful of options, they can get educated pretty quickly, because as you guys were saying, like there's usually only, one or two people that are actually making the decisions on this stuff. And so if we can give them, a firm, couple options and some dollar amounts or whatever that takes, I think that we might be pleasantly surprised with, what people might be willing to do. Because I know, from my subdivision down to Winding Trails, I think that's pretty much all of them except for one to the Triple Meander. And, those guys next to me are chomping at the bit to do something, because their common ground keeps getting eaten up. So that could work. All right. Anybody have anything else?
I might add, if you have any questions or comments, in addition to some details on rock grade controls that Mr. Sturman asked about, and some location data, latitude, longitude for the detention basins. If you have any suggestions or comments, I guess, Mr. Vunich, will you be the collector of those again? I noticed the hand, somewhat reluctantly, the hand went up. Okay. Again, we appreciate everyone's interest and participation and your comments and questions. It's certainly a great project. We'll get your questions addressed as soon as we get them and get a final report back to you. And Mr. Vunich, is there need for us to remain in the meeting, or should we go on our way and let you guys get on to other business?
Mr. Wilson, the next item on the agenda, when the co-chairs authorize it, is just a brief update on what I call now Phase 3, the permitting of the two critical projects. So you might just want to stick around and get the update with everyone else.
Okay.
Yeah, that was right where we were going to go there, Mr. Vunich. So you may take it away.
Well, thank you, Mr. Farmer. Mr. Farmer, Ms. Holthouse, and members of the task force, as you may recall at our July meeting, a decision was made by the members to proceed forward with the permitting process, although preliminary in nature, with the different federal, state, and local agencies relative to the Triple Meander and the detention basin near Anniversary Park. That recommendation was forwarded onto the Planning and Parks Committee of City Council, and then ultimately to City Council. When it was received by City Council, the City Council authorized the preparation of the legislation to proceed forward with the amendment of the contract with Wilson Hydro to include that. So from the perspective of the department, at the next meeting of City Council in September, that legislation will be in bill form for consideration. Therefore, if all were to go according to the recommendation of the task force, we will be proceeding forward with the beginning of that permitting process. And that's just another, I think, step in the direction that I hope the task force members are eager to achieve. If there are any questions regarding that matter, certainly anyone from any of the city team members can try to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions about where we're at, Mr. Berger?
Apologies, I must have missed the last meeting on vacation. I was just curious, we had identified the Evergreen Forest as one of the top priority locations. I assume that must have been discussed, and I apologize for asking for an ad hoc update there, but as you know, most are aware, although the actual funding mechanism for the resolution of this particular situation is, I think, up in the air, the immediacy of need for remediation, I think, is pretty important. So I'd love to just hear any perspective that I may have missed, and apologize again for missing that.
Yeah, Mr. Vunich, you want to take it away?
Sure, Mr. Berger. As you know, the Department of Planning has been a champion for that particular location, given what it's seen on site visits to that portion of the Cox Creek watershed. When reviewing the proposal from Wilson Hydro, it was specific to those two locations. Certainly, I can ask Wilson Hydro to include that and see what that might, how it will affect the bottom line to the proposal. And again, if there's no objection on the task force, we could at least ask for that cost and then see how it all fits in.
Yeah, without objection, I think we should definitely see what we can find out there.
And I would also add that, as I understood the scope for Evergreen, there was both stabilizing the bank, but there was also going to be some sort of a deflection device. And I'm wondering if that piece of scope could be separated from the other one to just kind of buy us some time. So if their cost analysis could kind of address, what those two pieces were split out and whether there was any point or benefit in doing the portion of it that would slow the speed of the flow and the direction of the flow coming into the creek from the bank stabilization.
If there's no objection from the two consultants, then I will ask them to do just that. And again, this is just to solicit a cost estimate to add it into that permitting process.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think unless you have a different suggestion there, Mr. Vunich, I think Mr. Wilson and Mr. Wagner, you guys may hop off if you would. I mean, you're certainly welcome to hang out and listen some more, but I'm sure you have some other things to do. So you may stay or go. I think we're good this evening. Thank you so much for your time and your presentation.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your interest and the opportunity to work with you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right, that brings us to funding, it looks like. Mr. Vunich, is that you or Mr. Sturman or all of the above?
Actually, I'll probably start, and it may include Mr. Cross, who's been part of the meetings at City Council where the parks and stormwater sales tax has been discussed. But just to kind of provide a brief review, as the task forces work through the identification of all of the different locations throughout the 9 watersheds that are in need of some type of investigation, repair, restoration, etc., the issue of funding has been identified again and again. Through the efforts of Mr. Sturman, we have identified, I think, every organization, agency, governmental body that might, on a good day, have money to allocate toward a project in a stormwater area or creek restoration or creek repair. To date, we have not been successful in obtaining a grant. And so ultimately, the task force settled on the parks and stormwater sales tax. As you know, that tax could potentially generate, I think, from the calculations done by Mr. Cross, upwards of $1.5 to $1.7 million. So nothing that certainly we couldn't use. A recommendation was forwarded to City Council in April of this year. The City Council delayed any consideration for 90 days. And Mr. Cross brought that matter back at the end of July, the last meeting in July. Mr. Cross, would you like to kind of take it from there?
Thank you, Mr. Vunich. With the permission of the chairs, I will just briefly say that when this was brought back up after the expiration of the 90 days, there was a discussion. I informed the council and we talked about other ballot measures that we are facing. In particular, in the April 2022 ballot, there would be the use tax issue. And that is contemplated to be on that ballot for the city. And it is not advisable to have more than one ballot measure at a time. So the parks and stormwater tax issue was delayed yet again to be addressed subsequent to that April 2022 ballot measure. So the earliest that the parks and stormwater tax issue would be addressed and discussed at council meeting would be May of 2022. Thank you, Mr. Vunich.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. So
Yes.
members of the task force,
Go ahead, Joe.
members of the task force, we're kind of at a juncture again where we have a potential project that Mr. Sturman's been working on with MDNR, the Department of Natural Resources. And Mr. Cross, I think, did an excellent job at the June and July meetings, kind of going over what may potentially be an option, and that's bonds. There's additional information in the memorandum that was prepared for tonight's meeting. But as I say, we've got a lot of things moving forward, whether it be the USGS study, the recommendations that came from Wilson Hydro, the permitting component, but we're still struggling with the funding aspect. And so again, I think tonight, if at all possible in the time we have, we could maybe get if the city team members can get some direction on how the task force thinks the next step should be relative to funding, I think it would be very much appreciated. Thank you.
I guess from my perspective, I'd just like to understand and be realistic about the limitations of what this committee can do. If we're not going to discuss new tax sources devoted specifically to parks and stormwater until May of 22, presumably nothing would be on the ballot until the fall of 22 at the earliest. And it would take another 2 or 3 years of revenue from those sources to fund, project 1 or 2, 1 and 2 on our list. So I think realistically, if we're going to do anything in the short term, it's going to require, including a bond issue, which says we have to pay the interest on it. It's going to require the city assessing its priorities and saying, some of the available money, and I don't think any of that's been sitting around with people, wondering what to do with it. I think it's going to take taking some of the available money and revenue that's coming in and redeploying it to, this is a higher priority than some other things. And I just struggle with how, our committee saying, we want more, is really helpful. It's not clear to me whether we're supposed to give recommendations about where it should get cut or whether we, just need to be a squeaky wheel about here's how much we need. But, what role can this committee have that's really constructive, I guess is my question.
Mr. Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Holthouse, you're absolutely right in terms of just how far this committee can go. I will say, and this is where I see the funding coming from. There are multiple avenues that we've discussed in the past in terms of some sort of a new revenue stream from taxes, bonds, etc. I believe that the best opportunity for funding to fund these types of projects will come from the infrastructure bill that is currently being discussed in Congress. It is my hope that, we're talking a lot of money out there, and I believe that of all the possible alternatives that the city has in terms to fund these kinds of issues, that's where it's going to come from. And that, there's been a lot of agreement on that bill in terms of it moving forward. And it may be in early 2022 when we have a clear picture, or maybe even later this year, perhaps, when we have a clear picture of what those dollars might be, when they might occur, et cetera. So I will say that from where I sit, I'm watching that very, very closely, because that's where I really believe that the funding is going to come from. Right now, there's not a real appetite with the city for taxes and bonds, I will say. It would take, a majority of the council to agree to that. We will take care of internet first. I mean, when you look at the 8 strategic goals, internet's 1, watershed's 3. We've taken care of the funding for the internet. The next big nut to crack is watershed. And the next big source of funding will come from the government in the form of that infrastructure bill. And I think that's the most likely scenario, in my opinion. Thank you.
So, Steve or Joe, or I guess Rick, I mean, I agree with you, Steve. I think that, the appetite for a tax or a bond is there doesn't seem to be much of one. So I'm wondering if what we can do and maybe look at the priorities that we've kind of set up here as a task force is, making sure that we are in the absolute best position, I guess, to move forward and apply for that money, or however that comes, which I feel like we're doing in terms of the permitting process and getting our, quotes and things from Wilson Hydro. Are there other components of this on some of these other, governmental funding projects that you guys do that we're missing or lacking that we can invest some time and energy in?
Mr. Chair, I will tell you that I'm very impressed with the work that this task force has done. You are very, very well positioned so that when funding is available, you've identified where the problem areas are. Tonight's presentation about things that can be done, the partnership with the USGS. I think you all have done an outstanding job, and I mean you're right there, and as a couple of you said, chomping at the bit, to move forward. The funding is the big issue, but from my perspective, I don't know what else you all could done. You've really covered the waterfront, no pun intended, in terms of being positioned to move forward as soon as money is available. It's just going to take a little bit before that money is available. That's my perspective, but you all are the experts on this stuff. My job is to find the money to give you so that you guys can move forward. So I can't speak to, is there anything else you all can be doing? That's more you guys, you're the experts.
Well, so then I'm wondering, or Carol, go ahead.
The only thing I guess I'm wondering is whether, since there may be some responsibility from HOAs for maintaining things, since there are some projects where we're not clear about, whether city fund, whether we're crossing lines on spending, city revenue or government revenue, or funding on private property. You'd mentioned just in passing once, Steve, some sort of neighborhood improvements association. I mean, is there anything we can be doing on either a nonprofit or taking these things that really are regional issues and saying, hey, maybe it's not your detention basin that's being worked on this year, but this is a regional issue, and there should be a larger pool contributing to whatever the detention basin or basins of the year is. So I guess if there's any sort of private arm that we should have or other kind of arm we should have in conjunction with the city revenues.
Chair Holthouse, there certainly as part of the discussion of funding sources, we did talk about neighborhood improvement districts, community improvement districts. Those are tools that can be used for financing sources. It's a little more difficult, a little bit. We haven't gone too far down that road, but these issues are kind of spread out a little bit. And so defining the boundaries of that SID or that NID would be a little bit difficult. But I did make a note during this evening's presentation. I'm going to follow up with our city attorney tomorrow with regards to public funds being used for private purposes. And there are instances when that can be done, when it affects the general health and safety and welfare of the public. And so I'm going to get a little more definitive reading from the city attorney, just how far we can take that, and then some of these other things. So while we are waiting for that infrastructure bill, we can look at some other avenues. There are costs involved in those SIDs and those NIDs, and you need buy-in, obviously, because that debt service needs to be handled by the folks, the HOAs, the residents that are affected, and some residents are affected and some aren't. So you got to be very careful in how you define those boundaries, but it is definitely a tool. It's an arrow in our quiver that we can look into, and I will do that.
One other thing, and I feel like maybe we've talked about this before, but I've forgotten now, but it might not be a bad idea to get Mr. Young's opinion, or, Joe or Rick. I mean, is it possible maybe to do like a temporary easement for some of these repairs where it becomes kind of sort of public land for a brief period of time and then either reverts back to the HOA or the homeowner? Or, I mean, we do that, I think, sometimes with some of the other components of these things, don't we? Not the creek per se, but, utility poles and things like that. Is that something like that possible?
I guess I can respond if you like. I think most projects, when we build them, we use a combination of temporary and permanent easements, sometimes out now at right-of-way acquisitions. So we own the property in fee. I would expect most of these instances, now I don't know about the detention basin retrofits, that's kind of a unique animal, but I would think most of these situations, we would probably take a permanent easement over the ground and maintain some rights to maintaining those facilities that are constructed. That's just my opinion. There'd probably be temporary easements as well that would be needed to be acquired to allow access or do other improvements, but I would think there would be some permanent rights or easements that would be acquired in the process. What I'm kind of curious about is the stormwater detention basin retrofits and how that might eventually play out, seeing that there are already maintenance agreements in place with HOAs and MSD typically to maintain those facilities. Those are a little bit different animals, but certainly we could do some more exploration in terms of those questions.
All right. Well, I guess maybe it would be helpful then for perhaps Mr. Vunich, would you like a motion, I guess, along the lines of, we're feeling like we're pretty prepared. And so in the event that magically federal funding becomes available in this infrastructure bill, we would very much like to pursue that as quickly as possible. Or do you feel like you've got a pretty good handle on the direction that we're talking about right now?
I would defer to Mr. Cross and Mr. Brown and Mr. Ron to kind of answer that question. I think we know we've got projects to expend money on. I don't know, again, if we think we need a motion, I would defer to the group, actually.
Mr. Chair, I don't think a motion is necessary. I think we know the direction. I'm going to continue looking at sources, but at this point, the task force is going to continue doing the work it's doing. We will continue to try to find sources of revenue to pay for that. But I think we all know the direction we're going. And so I don't believe that a motion really is necessary, in my opinion.
Great. Carol, go ahead.
Joe, do you think that there's anything we need to do to clarify with council? I just don't want them waiting for us to do something while we're kind of assuming they know what we want and need, and, as federal funds would become available. I listened to, the meeting after the fact. It was just kind of, there was a question of like, are we going to get more recommendation? I assume the committee will come back with additional recommendations. And I just don't want to have a job, description somebody thinks we've accepted without saying, I don't think we can do that, which is where I'm at.
Ms. Holthouse, if there's no objection from you and Mr. Farmer and the task force members, I typically provide an update to City Council relative to the discussions and direction of the task force, and I would include that as part of that update.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Do we want to, Joe, also include, and or maybe, oh yeah, go ahead, Larry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to Carol, to your comment, and as the city council members that are on this task force, as well as the entire group, is we represent the city. And I agree with what's been discussed on funding tonight. Now, like Steve mentioned, like internet's number one, and it clearly is number one for me. Number two is really not an expense item. It's a revenue enhancement. So really the next expense item is erosion control and, the improvement that we're talking about here. And I would, I would say I'll challenge myself, but I'm also just say I'll challenge everybody on the call tonight, is that we do need to just find some money in our city budget. I think we can do it. Or I should restate that. I know I can do it, but I'm not a nice person, but I'll get it done. But as I'm representing the Residents of Ward 1 and really as all of us here tonight and representing people, we're going to do a budget for next year. And we're going to make decisions on whether to include or exclude something from the budget, which to me essentially sets a priority. And I don't want to pick on anything in particular, but there was a consensus, very high consensus, that erosion control is very important. So it would be confusing to me that next year's budget would not include more funds for what at that point in time should now move up the ladder to our highest priority. Now, there's always pressure to spend money on other things, and I would love to mention some that I don't agree with, but I'm not. But that's where between Joe, Nate, and then the residents, the squeaky wheel. Greg, I would comment to you that you should start coming to every council meeting. I mean, you need to be the squeaky wheel. So I really would challenge ourselves to also get some money in the budget for it, a more meaningful amount of money next year. And I know that may not be a popular thing, but I would like to challenge all of us to do that. So that's what I'd like to add. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I guess as I'm thinking about it, I think what the council has heard is, we've got some top priority projects, and we're talking, hundreds of thousands at the low end and, over $1 million at the high end for any individual one. I think maybe it would be helpful for us to, in some way, I don't know whether it's a motion or whatever, but to elevate this idea of, if we switch our focus to detention basins, there's some things we can do that get us long-term improvement and buy us some time that aren't budget busters, that we can knock these things off. I think they were, $50,000 was kind of a nice round number that stuck with me. So I think if you kind of start realizing there are things we can do with some smaller bites, that might help change the conversation in a way that says it's practical to do something with the city budget.
Yeah, it's just a challenge. We need to challenge ourselves. And I think there's the funding source we really didn't talk about was the budget. And I do believe there should be money in our operating budget for what will probably, at least next year, will be our highest priority that's not funded. And again, that's not to say that next year's council might vote 10 items ahead of it. But if they vote 10 items ahead of it, then Carol, I would call those people and say, hey, what did you do? I mean, why is 10 swimming pools more important than erosion control, which we're not doing 10 swimming pools. But so I would just say that is that, we, challenge ourselves. I just think it's a good exercise. I mean, I think it's all positive. And that's how we improve. So.
Yeah, I agree. Mr. Brew, well, I got two hands up there. Let's see.
Mr. Berger's first.
Mr. Berger, knock yourself out.
Respectfully, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Barost. I just wanted to comment that I'm happy to be the squeaky wheel where grease can be applied, and I think maybe some being a bit of a novice at the process has left me unsure of where that could be. So I have showed up at city council meetings. That's how I got on this task force. I think I'm welcome to take that recommendation as well as any from any other members of this task force around how we can continue to shine as objective a light as possible on some of the immediate needs that we see together as a task force. So I definitely appreciate that. Please feel free to email me or contact me or swing by and check on the progress of our burgeoning cliff situation over here and provide that advice. So thank you.
Yeah, that's my thought on that. Just, for me personally, when I'm at the council, I always appreciate when residents come and speak. And I know that you have obviously a very personal situation going on with this, but speaking to it as a larger idea, not just your thing, I think will go a very, very long way. I know, for a lot of people, putting a face and a name next to, kind of humanizing the problem helps out a lot.
The other suggestion I might have would be to maybe start to engage someone from the real estate community and just, talk about what one really, really bad thing in Wildwood could do to the reputation of our community as a whole.
Mr. Cross.
'Cause I live along a creek and, it may not be one that the backyard's going to erode, but I'm sure, that'll be a big negative as soon as the first house or deck tumbles into the water. So.
Mr. Cross.
First of all, Mr. Vunich had his hand up before me, so I will defer to Mr. Vunich and then I'll speak after him.
Sure.
Well, Mr. Cross, I recognize the hierarchy I live under, so I'd be glad to hear your comment first.
Mr. Vunich, go right ahead. There's
Thank you.
no hierarchy here.
Well, I speak to the task force and hopefully this will make some sense. But I think we all recognize that we're not going to have a major construction project underway anytime soon. But over the course of the last 2 years, we have identified a number of things that we can continue forward with. And so what I would like to suggest is at our next meeting, we talk about those things, the stormwater management plan, the detention analysis that was identified by Wilson Hydro tonight, the monitoring program that they recommended. Maybe the task force can start talking about how we might go about doing something like that with the support of the Department of Public Works and significant input from Rick Brown and Dan Ron. The public education component that Ms. Holthouse has been pretty much working on by herself of late. Maybe we can come back to those items, provide more detail, more input, and then those may be the items that we can fund out of our budget, as Mr. Brost mentioned, because again, they're not in that high dollar, that $500,000 to $1.5 million range, but it's something that the task force can provide input to, then city team members and the city council then can identify them as if they are the priorities as set forth by the task force or not. And then we can continue to make progress on a lot of fronts while we wait for that infrastructure money that we all hope will come. Thank you.
Mr. Cross.
Thank you, sir. I wanted to reinforce the message that Mr. Brost made and Mr. Vunich kind of tagged on as well. Some of you may know, we've alluded to the strategic plan on a number of occasions tonight. The strategic plan encompassed work by the mayor, myself, and the council members over many, many council meetings, work sessions. We put in a lot of hours to develop a very comprehensive, a very inclusive strategic plan for the next 5 years, and then identified 8 strategic goals And as I mentioned, internet was number one, revenue enhancement was number two, and Mr. Brost agreed and said, or pointed out that erosion is number three. That plan, that strategic plan is kind of the roadmap for the next 5 years. The annual budget is supposed to be and will be, since it falls under my responsibility, will align with the strategic plan. That just makes sure that we are staying focused on the road that we laid out for the next 5 years. So Mr. Brost is absolutely correct in that when we put together not so much the operating plan, but the capital improvements plan, because that's where these dollars would fall, does in fact reflect these kinds of dollars. And since the watershed will elevate itself up to number one once we finally put the internet issue to bed, those, when we start laying out what our capital improvements plan is for 2022, primarily coming out of Mr. Vunich's budget and Mr. Brown's budget, should have dollars in there. And we will ensure that there's dollars in there to start knocking off some of this low-hanging fruit as it relates to watershed improvement. But that's what the annual budget is supposed to do. It's supposed to support all the effort that we put together on that strategic plan, and we will make sure that that happens. Thank you, sir.
So Steve, maybe, unless you guys think that this wouldn't be a great option, I mean, I know, at least for myself, the kind of matrix that was very elaborate for the city's strategic plan was helpful, I think, in helping people sort of itemize that conversation in their head. Maybe to Mr. Vunich's point before, like maybe we can do something similar to that, not nearly as in depth necessarily, about the priorities of the task force, assuming the top priority is let's just fix the failing creek, putting those other things in place and having at least a dollar range so that when it gets to the council and it gets a little bit further down the road here, we have an idea of like, hey, we can do, and I'm just making up numbers here, we can do one project or a couple projects, it's about 100 grand, and that's what we can do for the year. And whether that's means we knock out 8 of our 10 priorities because those are the smaller things, great. Or we may opt to do, one of the big ones. We won't know until we have that conversation, I guess.
Well, I think having that prioritization for the top 3 or 5 items that this task force wants to address and the dollar amount associated with it is definitely important. We have to have that. That's the mini roadmap, if you will, of that. And so I don't foresee, I have been working with our finance officer for the last couple of weeks on our mid-year 2021 budget, the mid-year adjustments, which is something we do. I can say that there's probably not any funds available to do this year unless the council decides they want to take them from certain buckets, and I can assist in that discussion with council. But this is probably more in 2022. But definitely, we need to know which are the top projects, the low hanging fruit ones, the smaller dollar amounts that you all feel are the ones that we can hit, and that we'll do everything we can then to incorporate that into the 2022 budget.
Awesome. All right. Well, do we think, what kind of timeline do you think you guys might need to put that sort of in a similar way that we had the city priority list, just a Google Doc or whatever that's got that thing and we can kind of bang out very quickly? Like, do we want to throw some money at education, or do we want to do these detention basins or whatever it is? Is that something that we can put together for the next meeting, or do you guys need some more time for that? What do you think?
Well, with Mr. Cross's permission and the co-chairs, our budget process pretty much starts in earnest next month, September, and that's not that far away. And from the perspective of the department's operating budget, that's October, and the capital improvements is November. So I would like to jump into this at our September meeting if there's no objection on any part of on the parts of the people participating tonight.
Does anybody object to such an idea? I see some thumbs up. All right, I think we're good to proceed with that.
Mr. Chair, the only other item I had is, I know Mr. Sturman's been working diligently with MDNR, and if there's time, I'd love to have an update.
Absolutely.
Yes, okay. I guess was the last meeting or meeting before, it was good to hear we have a project identified with drawings and cost, estimated cost. A lady named Ms. Trish Roddy of DNR mentioned that to me once, that we would like to see a project. And so I went back, so we got a project. I'll make this kind of fast, but I said, we got a project. Well, that didn't seem to go anywhere. She said, yeah, that's fine, but that's about as far as it went. And then she referred me to her superior DNR, a fellow named Rob Hunt. And so Mr. Hunt and myself have had some conversation, at least a couple, I guess, and some couple of emails. And we had a good, fairly long conversation, which I described our situation and what we're trying to do. So then I'm getting the impression DNR, I don't know. I don't have much hope for DNR after all of this. Mr. Hunt says I need to refer you to some other folks, which he has. And by the way, let me back up. When Miss Riley emailed me, which was good, she included, when I first went back to her, because she had done previously, I'm going to go way back here again, I'm sorry. She included 7 other individuals. About half of them were DNR, but the other half were with the EPA. And I thought, well, I'm going to use that. That's some good coverage. Because especially EPA, that's where the biggest money should occur. And so they've been reminded, all these people, I have emailed to all those people our situation, and so they know all about us and Wildwood and what we're trying to do. Now fast forward, Mr. Hunt then referred me to some other folks, and he has made contact with them. And then sometimes I follow up, and he had a feeling like a fellow named Jim Wild, was East West Gateway organization. And Mr. Wild is the executive director. And then we have a lady named Mary Lewandowski. She is a director of community planning with East West Gateway. And then included in that was a fellow named Doug Hermes. He is a statewide planning coordinator with the Missouri Association and Councils of Government. I've never heard of that one before. That's a new organization to me. I had a long time back in my beginnings, I made contact with East West Gateway. Well, anyway, Mr. Hunt has strong feelings that these would be good people to get on board and then have them go to maybe some individuals they might know. So I guess I can say there's a lot of coverage. And I've had a kind of a new push here going. And so I'm going to cover these people and just keep going. And I guess all I can say is we'll see what comes from it. And so that's basically the latest, what's happening in my bailiwick.
Mr. Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would ask, with your permission, for Mr. Brown to come online. Mr. Brown knows those folks, Mr. Sturman, that you just mentioned. He works with East West Gateway all the time, and so he may be able to help you. He deals with them, and like I say, he knows those players quite well. And again, with the chair's permission, maybe Mr. Brown can share some information with you.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Well, I don't. Thank you, Steve. I don't know that I have any enlightening words to add, but certainly Gateway, East West Gateway is an organization, and their role is to lead the metro area for planning, and they also do oversee a lot of different funding programs, and we utilize federal funding for highway improvements that goes through East West Gateway all the time. But the folks that you mentioned are certainly very influential and involved on the water resources side of their shop. And I don't know if we've really made a strong effort to talk to Gateway through this task force, but it might not be a bad idea to do that more formally than we may have done so far. Because you just never know where that might lead. I don't know there's any obvious pots of money that are out there, but again, the more people become aware of the efforts of this task force and the problems we're trying to address, ultimately you might put two and two together and get some money. So that might be something we could certainly move forward with, is just to try to initiate a more formal contact with Gateway as a task force and make sure they're on board and educated with what this group is doing.
All right. Well, Rick, do you need like a motion for that, or can we just all give you the thumbs up to say that sounds like a plan?
Well, I'm trying to think as I say that how we best want to do that, and Joe and I may want to put our heads together a little bit. Well, or maybe it's just an invitation to a further meeting and an agenda item to see if we can get them to attend, and then maybe a briefing to them is what this task force has been working on over the past 2 years.
I think that sounds like a great plan.
Yeah.
I like putting your heads together and inviting you to the meeting.
Okay.
Let's do both of those unless anybody objects to such a thing. All right. Well, I know we've got some other things. I think, however, on our agenda, it makes sense to me to probably continue to push these things along and perhaps break this stuff down in kind of that matrix as we discussed. So is there anything else, any questions, concerns, anything anybody else has, I guess, here before we wrap up this evening? Mr. Vunich.
Just as a reminder, and I think Mr. Wilson hit upon this at the conclusion of his presentation, if you have any questions or any suggestions relative to the report that was presented tonight, if you pass them on to me at your convenience, I'd sure appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. Anything else? Carol, you got anything you want to close us out with?
No, I just think we have kind of made good progress in going through the critical, location mitigation, identification budget. I'm very encouraged by the preliminary report on what might be possible in terms of impact and budget that maybe is more achievable on the detention basin side. And I think, as we step back and look at things that, certainly there are things on their the consultant's implementation list that certainly maybe engaging volunteers and doing some things like that might also be some of those ideas we had at the beginning that it's time to, revisit and maybe move up the priority list. But, I'm feeling good about we've made progress on the things we focused on, and maybe we're as far as we can get with some of those. And I like your idea, Joe, of, kind of stepping back and doing a nice overview of all of those things. So I think that's a great goal for our next meeting. And I thank everybody for their time and energy that got us to the point we're at. So.
Absolutely. All right. Well, with that, I guess I can take a motion to adjourn. Mr. Ottenberg, anybody care to second? Mr. Brost. All right. Without objection, all in favor of adjourning, please say aye.
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 It sounded like enough. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
We will see you next month. And if you care to join us at the council, we'll be there here in a couple weeks. So it's always very exciting coming out and see us. Have a good one, everybody. Thanks so much for your time.
Good night, everyone.